All right. Congratulations again to each of you on this Unit 4 team. My name is Rebecca Tinder. I'm the West Virginia We the People coordinator and your facilitator for Unit 4. Our judges have arrived and they will introduce themselves. The students will introduce themselves and their teacher, and then we shall begin.
Hello, Unit 6 from Indiana. It's nice to be here with you. I'm really looking forward to your testimony and our active conversation in your questions and answers. My name is Lynn Simons, and I'm the Chief Judge of the 2nd Judicial District Court in the state of Nevada. And before any presentation that I do, I always take a very deep breath. So I'm going to ask you to do that now. And I think one of my colleagues will ask you to exhale.
Yeah, you may want to exhale about now. And like we say, if you want to go yoga poses, do your thing. But we're ready just about for you. I'm Hank Chambers, law professor, University of Richmond. Been at this for a while. Actually, I saw you all not too long ago, just a couple of days ago. So it's good to see you again. Congratulations for making it to the final day. And I look forward to a good conversation.
My name is Joe Stewart. I teach in the political science department at Clemson University in South Carolina. I know I still do because I'm in my office today and they let me in. We warned you when we saw you last time that you might see us again, and we're happy to see you again. So relax. We're going to have more fun today talking with you and learning from you about the Constitution.
I'd like you to introduce yourselves and your teacher.
Hello, we are Unit 4 from Team Indiana from Fishers High School in Fishers, Indiana. My name is Shreya Maineni. I'm a senior this year, and next year I plan on attending the University of Southern Indiana to study biochemistry and public health.
Hi, I'm Braden. I'm currently a junior, and next year I plan on working on my application to my dream school, Notre Dame.
Hi, I'm Laura. Next year, I'm a senior as well. And next year I will be attending Indiana University to study history. And our teacher is Mrs. Paternoster, and our unit advisor is Mr. Tees.
All right, Unit 4, how have the values and principles embodied in the Constitution shaped American institutions and practices? Question 2, the president, quote, ought to communicate such papers as the public good would permit, and ought to refuse those the disclosure of which would injure the public, close quote. Do you agree or disagree that the executive can withhold or disclose information at her or his discretion? To what extent, if any, has the claim of executive privilege expanded presidential power since its inception? Are the constitutional powers that enable the other two branches to counter executive privilege claims sufficient? Why or why not? You may begin.
We believe that the executive can withhold or disclose information at their discretion with a few caveats.
These include not withholding information that could interfere with the investigation of a possible crime or be used to cover up government negligence. Executive privilege is an important aspect of protecting national security.
Giving the executive the ability to not disclose every detail it receives ensures that certain information is not dangerously misconstrued upon delivery or interpretation. However, in cases such as U.S. v. Reynolds of 1953, the executive misused its privilege for their own protection.
President Eisenhower notably used executive privilege 44 times during his presidency. His usage was later questioned by President Johnson, who was concerned that he may have gone too far. However, this privilege has undergone great changes.
The Nixon v. United States decision of 1974 established the privilege as not absolute. Following Nixon's attempt to withhold tapes concerning Watergate, the courts ruled that neither the doctrine of separation of powers nor the need for confidentiality of high-level communications grants the president an absolute, unqualified presidential privilege. Nixon's attempt both undermined a congressional investigation and prevented Congress from doing their job.
Executive privilege has been lessened since its inception in the time of the early presidents to the modern application of executive power.
Executive privilege has its origins in the early days of our nation, when following a military defeat in 1792, Congress began an investigation into the conduct of said battle. President Washington resisted this, and Congress later backtracked and requested only those documents of a public nature. This was the first exercise of executive privilege.
While succeeding presidents would steadily use this tactic, the next big shift happened during the Eisenhower administration. This was the first coining of the term executive privilege, and this represented the height of its power. Executive privilege was used to keep documents and information out of the hands of the public and senators during the HUAC investigations.
Almost 3 decades later, the case of US v. Nixon established the extent of executive privilege when the court said that anything that is key to an investigation must be given over. This led to Watergate tapes being given to Congress, President Clinton having to testify in front of Congress 2 separate times, and 1,300 documents relating to the Obama-era Fast and Furious investigation being released.
This all culminated in the Trump presidency, leading to a lawsuit where documents pertaining to President Trump's businesses were not forced to be given over. And the court established the Mazars test, which established a new standard for evaluating the use of executive privilege.
Our unit believes that the constitutional powers given to the legislative and judicial branch to counter executive privilege claims have not been sufficient. And over time, the check on this privilege has come to rely on the rule of law and the political will of Congress.
The legislative branch's check on executive privilege include subpoena power, holding people for contempt, and criminal referral. The judicial branch's check, on the other hand, has been far more limited due to its hesitancy to address political questions between the other branches.
Institutionally, if both branches use their power optimally, they could serve as a check on executive privilege. However, their use of these powers has come to rely on the pressures they face from the American people.
In most cases, the executive branch also feels these pressures and overrides executive privilege claims of their predecessors or simply refuse executive privilege. This can be seen in how the federal government handled the 9/11 crisis, Iran-Contra investigation, and even just recently with the January 6th committee.
However, this check hasn't always been sufficient. In the Fast and Furious investigation, the legislative and judicial checks took 4 years to be successful in overcoming President Obama's claims of executive privilege. Even when the press was closely following the investigation, it took 2 years for the Nixon administration to release transcripts and tapes to the Senate Investigative Committee. We have finished our prepared statement and are now ready to answer your questions.
So there's the concept that power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely. And you've identified weaknesses in putting a check on that power if it is abused. What other things do you think Congress can do other than subpoena and contempt?
So another check that the legislative branch has on the executive branch is the power to impeach the president. The House of Representatives can impeach, and then the Senate can remove the president from office. And I think this is an important check that a lot of presidents are fearful of, and that it can prevent.
Good afternoon, Mr. Tigers. It's about that time.
And in addition, even former President Theodore Roosevelt in 1909, sorry about that, former President Theodore Roosevelt in 1909 kind of talked to this idea and said that if Congress wanted the information they requested from him, they would have to go through impeachment. So it has been seen in presidents kind of acknowledging this fear almost in themselves, not even a fear, but them knowing the way that Congress has a check on them is to impeach them.
How realistic is that as a check? Do you think presidents go in and think, oh, I've got to be careful about using executive privilege because I could be impeached?
I mean, honestly, looking at the past 2 tries at trying to impeach the president, I would say it's not as effective as it could be. However, I still think that it's ineffective. I think that it still does provide a check. And as we can see, when presidents have resigned due to the pressures that they've faced from impeachment trials, I think that it still does provide them with limits to how they can use their power.
Well, if the basic problem is the executive has more information and control of that information, are there ways that Congress can increase its level of information or control over information that they may have used or you would suggest? Or just other techniques that Congress could use to thwart what the president might do?
I would say that the structure of how congressional investigations and how they relate to executive privilege, I think that the scope of their different powers. I think they're efficient in today's society. I think, or like within our government itself, the Constitution of America was founded on one of the main pillars of separation of powers. And I think that congressional investigations being limited to the legislative function and the executive branch being able to kind of separate the information that they have and what they control, I think that it's very effective in doing so between drawing a line between Article 1 and Article 2 within our Constitution.
And Congress can also pass acts and laws that influence the amount of information they have. Something like the Presidential Records Act passed in the wake of the Watergate scandal is now having modern application in something like the January 6th Select Committee's subpoena on President Trump, to where they now have to store more records and give the Congress more information than they would have previously.
So in your opening, you mentioned Trump versus Mazars. Do you remember, can you remind us what the court decided in that case? And do you think the court got it right?
So in Trump v. Mazars, that case was mainly in how the congressional investigations and how congressional subpoenas can relate and how they interact with executive privilege. And what they came out with is that basically that the congressional subpoena has to be in relation to the legislative function of that committee or investigation, and that the information that they're trying to subpoena can only come from whoever they're subpoenaing within the executive branch. And I think that yes, we have some room to evolve as we have since the Kilbourne test in 1881, but I think that they did get it right in this instance.
So,
Okay. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
no, go ahead.
No. So how much discretion should a president have to withhold documents? Presumably the president's going to want to withhold more documents. Congress is going to want to get them. Where is that line? Where would you all draw that line?
So any document that has legitimate legislative intent as decided by the Supreme Court should be available to Congress. And it's being seen currently in the case of Trump v. Thompson, which was decided at the district level, but it was relating to documents from the Trump presidency. And because it had legitimate legislative intent, all of the documents related to the January 6th insurrection were given over to committee.
So would the limitations that President Eisenhower had, would those qualify as being legitimate withholding of documents under what you all believe is the proper rule?
So in the McCarthy investigations, President Eisenhower used executive privilege to prevent Congress from subpoenaing information from his advisors to make sure that they would have free discourse within that high level of the executive branch in order to be able to function properly. And I think that this is an important function of executive privilege. I think that if Congress can subpoena all of this information, then not one, Congress doesn't necessarily need all of that information for their legislative intent. And two, I think that it would decrease the functionality of the executive branch by decreasing how much they feel like they're safe, they can safely talk within themselves.
So it appears that this has set up a situation where Congress is chasing after the documents. And you mentioned the changes in records retention requirements. What is your position on whether it should be flipped somewhat and the president should be required to provide a privilege log that generally describes what they want to hold back? Do you agree or disagree with that concept?
I would generally disagree. I think that by having the president log what they're keeping to themselves under the executive privilege, it kind of defeats the point of having executive privilege. I think it would remove the separation of power. And yes, it would provide some transparency within Congress, between Congress and the executive branch, but this wouldn't necessarily be good for our country and the separation of power doctrine.
I would agree with this change, actually, because it is so vital for Congress to have strong information, and because so often in the past, we've actually seen the executive branch attempt to misuse executive privilege, such as Clinton using it multiple times with the Lewinsky scandal, Nixon trying to utilization on grand jury investigations. If they had to explicitly say what they were blocking or what they were trying to protect and explain why, it could lead to better and more use rather than an attempt to use it in a broad sense for things that aren't applicable.
However, I think it can be useful, especially in a sense of just having a list of how it has been used. They don't have to necessarily go into detail, but having a way for the president and even Congress to know not exactly what specifically the president is trying to withhold, but what exactly the idea is so that they have some understanding. And it could increase the relationship between Congress and the presidency, because as it is now, there's a little bit of tension between what the Congress is trying to get from the president and what the president is trying to withhold from the Congress. So having that stated, even just in general terms, this is for security, it can really help that relationship.
Is the concept of executive privilege becoming obsolete? That is, if our purpose is to maintain secrecy, given the way the media covers things, given the way social media exists, will your class 100 years from now be talking about this?
So I would say that presidential privilege here was going extinct for a period. Within the last 10 presidents before Trump, there was 33 uses of executive privilege. The numbers were strongly dwindling until President Trump actually came into office. And in the future, we might see somewhat of a resurgence if presidencies become more controversial and there's more politicization. But otherwise, we will likely see this trend continue and a lessening of uses.
I would actually like to disagree with my colleague Brady. I think that by having the president assume the role of commander-in-chief, he or she has the responsibility to national security. And I think that when in times of war or somewhat kind of like war, like we are now, I think that it's important for our national security for Congress not to have all of that information and for the president to be able to protect that information in order to protect the citizens.
But doesn't Congress have a role in foreign policy and war making?
And currently this role is underutilized because of AUMF. But if Congress were to perhaps gain more information, they could take a more active role and start basically declaring war more often, seeing that the last time we did was all the way back in World War II.
You get the last word. Thank you.
Well done. Thank you so much for that active discussion. And I appreciated that you took we knew exactly at the beginning where you stood, and then how you brought up some examples we have not heard today. It's a difficult subject because to grapple with, which is why it's the perfect subject for We the People. And I liked that you brought up Massers, and then I do think you could broaden a little bit more on what Congress can do. I mean, it's just fundamental, hold back the purse strings from anything that the president wants, right? It's kind of a practical, but you centered on legitimate powers. And it's interesting because I thought you worked really well together and complemented each other really well and had an excellent cadence that was easy to follow and understand. And we boxed you in to a couple places. And I like to see it when you do disagree with and you bring a fresh perspective. So thank you. I enjoyed it.
Thank you.
Yeah, I agree with that as well. Lots of good stuff in the opening, lots of good stuff during the Q&A. There were some times where we were clearly trying to push you in some direction to think about things a little bit differently. I think part of it may be the age difference. And you may say, oh, everyone says it. But here's the thing, and I think I kind of feel it out of Judge Stewart, and that is impeachment means something very different to us old heads than to you younger folks. When we were growing up, only one president had ever been impeached, Andrew Johnson, right? Because we all knew that Nixon had not been impeached. But for you all, Clinton, Trump is so you all are thinking, well, impeachment is just one of those normal things that you just sort of do. Meanwhile, we're thinking boy, impeachment is break glass in case of emergency. So it's real interesting to think about those differences in terms of what we're looking at. But a lot of really good and interesting conversation. Not a surprise, because that's always the case with y'all from Indiana. So good luck. I think this is probably y'all's last round. I hope it's been a great experience, and boy, do we have fun today with this conversation.
Yeah, we did indeed. And let me hasten to add, I was not around for Andrew Johnson's impeachment, despite what Judge Chambers may have suggested here. But yeah, I think you are right. And I would argue that I was trying to push you to think about other things that I think you know, but you're so focused in on this question. You know that Congress has appropriation powers. You know that the Senate can confirm nominations. Think about those things, because those are tools that could use. If the Senate holds up presidential nominations, might they get the president to turn loose of some stuff? But I don't say that to in any way denigrate what you did tell us. It was all very good. You did a great job today. I very much enjoyed our conversation. I always enjoy having conversations with the students from Indiana about this. So very good job. Good to see you again, and congratulations.
And I'm clearly younger than both of them
That's
on the
true.
impeachment scale.
Oh, congratulations again.